This video provides an overview of consumer vulnerability, the approaches businesses can take to improve interactions with vulnerable consumers and achieve positive outcomes. I will also talk about the ISO 22458 Inclusive Service Standard, a new and internationally recognized standard that provides a framework to help organizations improve their approach to vulnerable consumers. In the UK, the Financial Conduct Authority released some guidance in 2021 on the fair treatment of vulnerable customers. This guidance covers understanding the needs of vulnerable consumers, approaches to ensure that treating customers fairly, protecting the interests of vulnerable consumers, ongoing monitoring of activities to ensure meeting consumers' needs. A vulnerable consumer is someone who, due to their personal circumstances, is especially susceptible to detriment, particularly when a firm is not acting with appropriate levels of care. Vulnerability can be characterized by a spectrum of risks, and all customers are at risk of becoming vulnerable. The four key considerations when assessing vulnerability are health, life events, resilience, and capability. If businesses do not take into account the needs of vulnerable consumers, this can lead to a situation where the interaction can cause harm or negative outcomes for the vulnerable user. This can be avoided with the correct approach. Because of this, many businesses are becoming increasingly concerned with their approach to dealing with vulnerable consumers. This approach includes completing checks on their own methods, in addition to the approach taken by anyone working on their behalf to make sure that vulnerable consumers are identified. Vulnerable consumers are dealt with fairly. All contact channels and touchpoints are accessible and easy to understand. Treating customers fairly can help reduce the potential for fines for mistreatment of vulnerable consumers and can improve the overall competitive advantage. Developing an approach for dealing with vulnerable consumers may seem like a daunting prospect, but this is where the ISO 22458 Inclusive Service Standard comes in. This standard provides the framework which can be used as the basis for developing an approach that ensures a clear approach for dealing with vulnerable consumers is developed. Clear commitment to achieving positive outcomes for vulnerable consumers. Fair treatment of consumers. Inclusive service design. Legal compliance across all services. Staff are trained to identify vulnerability and achieve positive outcomes. For companies looking to meet these requirements, AlphaZ Documents have prepared an ISO 22458 toolkit which includes all the necessary documents and guidance to set up effective systems. This will help to ensure an inclusive service is developed. This toolkit includes Vulnerable Consumer Procedure, Internal Procedure, Code of Conduct and Policy for Vulnerable Consumers, Public Statement, Vulnerable Consumer Risk Assessment and Risk Registers, Implementation Checklist, Forms for reviewing inclusive design, collecting feedback, reporting, monitoring and completing accessibility reviews, Training and guidance resources, Audit checklists for ensuring ISO 22458 compliant. Does your business deal with vulnerable consumers on a regular basis? Or do you require your staff to take part in training for dealing with vulnerable people? Would a consolidated and centered approach help tidy things up? With a consumer vulnerability-centered management system, you could cover GDPR, positive outcomes, continuous improvement, and FCA guidance all in one. Certification through the use of your toolkits would spotlight your company as having an effective and legally compliant approach to consumer vulnerability. Thanks for watching. If you wish to inquire further, please visit isomanage.com. Documents featured can be downloaded from AlphaZ Documents.